Hello, everyone. My name is Sonia Cichoria, and I'm the Alumni and Events Officer for the Faculty of Environmental Studies. We are going to be using the Zoom meeting platform. So for the best user experience, please disable your microphone as well as your video. Questions have been submitted in advance via the registration, and we have quite a bit of questions to get through, so we'll try our best to get through them all. You're also encouraged to submit questions using the chat button below, and we will also go through those as well. For recruitment questions, we would like to welcome all prospective students and current students. If you have any questions pertaining to the recruitment process, please also submit them in the chat box, and a member of the recruitment team will respond to you directly from there. We are also recording today's session, so if you have to leave earlier, no problem. We'll be posting that on our YouTube channel afterwards. And we're also live on Facebook right now, so feel free to encourage your friends and family to join us there as well. I will now like to hand it over to the Faculty of Environmental Studies Dean, Alice Havorka.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging York University's presence on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It's now home to many Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I would like to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And this area is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. It is World Bee Day, and the Faculty of Environmental Studies and the Faculty of Science at York University have partnered to host this event online, so welcome. Today we're featuring professors from the Bee Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation BEEc Lab. And our event's being moderated by York Alumna Megan Leslie, who's the president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund. As Sonia mentioned, participants have submitted questions in advance via registration, and there's a Q&A box available for those who wish to submit any other questions. It is my pleasure to now introduce you to our moderator, Megan Leslie, who graduated from York University in 2003 with the Bachelor of Arts. Megan Leslie began as president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada in December of 2017 after nearly 2 years at the organization, first as a consultant on ocean governance and then as head of ocean conservation. Before joining WWF, Megan was a member of Parliament representing Halifax. During her 2 terms, she served as deputy leader of the official opposition, environment critic, and vice chair of the Government Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. In Parliament, Megan introduced a motion to ban plastic microbeads. This motion passed unanimously, leading to a ban on the Canadian manufacturing, sale, and importation of these products. She also expedited the creation of Sable Island National Park Reserve. I'm thrilled to have Megan joining us today. Thank you for moderating our session, Megan. I'll now turn it over to you.
Thanks for that warm welcome. And I am thoroughly delighted to be here today. And I'm also really delighted at how many people are talking about bees and pollinators these days, because they really are our unsung heroes. Pollinators, like bees, help many plants reproduce, including a lot of our food crops. And people do think about bees a lot in terms of food, but they don't just contribute directly to food security. They are also key to conserving biodiversity. And conserving biodiversity is a cornerstone of the Sustainable Development Goals. Bees also serve as sentinels or alarm systems for emerging environmental risks because they can signal the health of a local ecosystem. So as you can see, bees are really important to the planet, but it's not easy being a bee these days. They are facing so many threats, things like invasive insects, pesticides, changes to the way we use land, monocropping practices. All these things make it harder for bees to survive. And that's why the UN designated the 20th of May, so today, That's why it's designated as World Bee Day. So happy World Bee Day, everyone. World Bee Day helps raise awareness of the importance of pollinators, the threats that they face, and their contribution to sustainable development. And luckily for us, there is a crackerjack bee team right here at York University. This leading team is using cutting-edge research tools to broaden our knowledge in the fields of bee biology, ecology, and conservation, or the BEEc team. And their aim is to provide beekeepers, scientists, government agencies, and the public, so us, with the information that we need on the status of wild and managed bees for making recommendations for sustainability of our agricultural and natural ecosystems. Today, we're joined by 4 faculty professors that are part of that research team. First, I'll introduce Sheila Colla, Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies. And Sheila is a classically trained ecologist who uses scientific principles to address real-world conservation issues. Her research thus far is focused on the conservation of lesser understood native species like bees, butterflies, and flowering plants. As pollinators and pollination have become important issues among policymakers and the public in recent years, her work has become more interdisciplinary. She works quite closely with environmental NGOs, landowners, academic partners, and government agencies at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels to implement conservation management based on the best available science. Her research considers species with large ranges across the US and Canada, but also local species that are at risk here in Ontario. We're also joined by Laurence Packer, Professor of Biology, and his lab research focuses on wild bees, of which there are over 20,000 species divided into approximately 500 genera. The research collection he manages has almost 95% of these bee genera represented, and likely more than 30% of the world's bee species, with examples from over 100 countries. There are hundreds of undescribed species in this collection, and Laurence and his team are working to describe them. They have also worked on the ecology, behavior, population genetics, and conservation of bees, and are active in DNA barcoding of the bees of the world. Recent graduate students have performed revisionary studies of genera, described new species, placed fossils within rigorous phylogenetic framework, studied the behavior and ecology of urban bees, and investigated bee biogeography in the Atacama Desert. Also with us today is Sandra Rehan, Assistant Professor of Biology. Sandra is an evolutionary biologist. She studies bees to understand the origin, maintenance, and elaboration of cooperation. She's also interested in phylogenomics and biogeography to understand the habitat requirements and diversification of bees around the globe. Most recently, her research also examines the dietary breadth, microbiome, population genomics, and landscape ecology of wild bees to sustain pollinator health. Recent graduate students have documented plant pollinator networks for wild bees across a variety of landscapes, characterized species declines and range shifts using historical museum records, and studied pollen nutrition and pathogen loads of wild bees. Taken together, her work combines a passion for fundamental bee biology with the need for applied conservation. And finally, we're joined by Amro Zayed, Associate Professor of Biology. Amro is interested in studying the genetics and evolution of social insects. Why and how did sociality evolve? What are the genetic basis of social traits? How does social behavior affect patterns of genome evolution? Amro is also interested in applying genomic tools to guide the conservation of native pollinators and to improve the health of managed honeybees. Graduate students in his group are exposed to a broad range of bee and social insect research, not just through international and inter-university collaborations, but also through interaction with colleagues at BEEc. So, as you heard, this is truly a panel of bee experts. And you know who is not a bee expert? Me. I am not a bee expert. And I think I know what a bee is, but when I hear in Laurence's bio that there are over 20,000 wild bee species, I realize that when I'm thinking of bees, I'm probably just picturing a bumblebee. So let's start at the beginning. What are bees? Laurence, you've got this impressive research collection, so I'll start with you. What are you collecting and what are bees?
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction and the question. So bees are basically vegetarian wasps. They went down the food chain. Instead of collecting other organisms as food for their offspring, they collect pollen and nectar, and they make that, most species will make that into a pollen ball, and then they lay the egg on it. So bees are vegetarian wasps. There are 20,000 or almost 500 described species. And the real number, if we had all of them, is probably closer to 30,000. Most bees are not anything like what most people think they are. Most bees nest in the ground and are entirely solitary. There are quite a lot of bees that nest in pithy stems or holes in wood. Some nest in snail shells. Some have been found nesting in the fuel lines of crashed aircraft, but they weren't the cause of the crash. So bees are quite different from what most people think they are, and their diversity is phenomenal. They range in size from 1.6 millimeters to maybe 4 centimeters long. Some of them are so small you can get 600 of them in a nest the size of a walnut.
Wow, that really is completely different than, you know, they live in a hive and they're all together and they make honey and so they're vegetarian wasps. I'm assuming then the flip side is wasps are carnivorous.
Yeah, most of the wasp relatives of bees are in fact carnivorous. Yeah, so the group of wasps that are most closely related to bees collect aphids or thrips as food for their offspring. And it's not too difficult to see that there's a switch from tiny little sweet things, which is what aphids are if you eat them, to going to pollen and nectar. So what we see here in the picture is one representative bee from each of 6 of the 7 different families. The 7th family isn't shown here because it's only found in Australia and there's only 21 described species. Top left, we've got a masked bee. In the middle at the top, we've got an opal banded bee. Some of these are actually very important for alfalfa pollination in the US prairies. On the top right, we've got it's related to an orchard bee. It's a rather beautiful metallic green one. Bottom left, we've got a giant meganomia bee, only found in southern Africa. In the middle, we've got a longhorned bee. These are found pretty much all over the world. This particular one is from Chile. And at the bottom right, we've got an andrenid, which, you know, a common name for all of those would be solitary mining bees.
Thanks, Laurence. That's a great, that's a super intro for us. Sheila, I see there's already some questions in the chat about health and conservation. So I'd like to ask you, now that we have an idea of what bees are, can you tell us a little bit about their health and their conservation?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of conservation, the insects have generally been ignored for quite a bit of time, and we've only recently really started to see large-scale papers that show that actually insect abundance and diversity might also be in decline. Usually when you think of conservation of wildlife, you have these images of like polar bears and sort of the large megafauna, but people are becoming more and more appreciative of the little things that run the world. So I work on bumblebees, which is a small group of our 850 Canadian native bees. There's only about 40 or so species of bumblebees in Canada, but they're a small group, but they're one of the best known groups for insects. People generally can, appreciate a bumblebee. They're large, they're fuzzy. We have really good museum specimens. They're relatively easy to identify. So that's sort of where we've started, or where my research has started in terms of looking at declines in conservation. And what we know from doing the IUCN Red List of our North American bumblebee species is about a quarter of them are at risk of extinction. And it really depends on the species in terms of what that looks like. So for some species, it's kind of the slow decline over quite a few decades. But for some species, like the rusty patch bumblebee, which some people may have heard of, the decline has been over 90% over a large range throughout eastern US, through the Midwest and southern Ontario and Quebec. So some species have declined really rapidly, some kind of more slowly, and we think these differences probably have to do with their different ecological needs and maybe different parasites or pesticides that they might be exposed to, different life history traits that would cause those things to impact them differently. So when you hear about bee declines, it's really like hard for me to know what that means because there's so many different types of bees and they all need different things and they're all being threatened by different stressors as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Amro, from your perspective, I mean, you look into the sociality of bees, and are there particular health or conservation issues from the perspective of your work?
Yeah, so I think in general, like people call them the four P's that are the kind of what we think are the major stressors. So this would be pesticides that farmers use in their farms, or in some cases, your neighbor might be putting stuff on their lawn. There is parasites and pathogens. So parasites are like mites that would sit on honeybees and kind of eat some of their internal organs, but also viruses within a bee and within bee communities, and these viruses could move around from species to species. And then the last bit, actually not really the last bit, but the last of the four P's is poor nutrition. So how the landscape provides habitat and resources for bees in terms of plants that they forage on, and more recently we're starting to become a little bit more concerned about climate change as well. So how is climate change going to influence the landscape, and are bees going to be able to move around to deal with their environments warming or changing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really glad that all of you are doing this work to help us understand more about what is happening with bees. But I also know that you can't do it alone. You know, science is a key component of this, but we all need to work on this issue. Sheila, I follow you on Twitter, and I know one thing I know about you is you have a lot of partnerships with everything, community groups, environmental NGOs, the private sector. And I think you're doing a panel right after this one with WWF. Thank you for doing that. World Bee Day is a busy day. So with those partnerships and how the science blends with those partnerships, can you explain why you need those kinds of partnerships to get your work done?
Yeah. So as my bio kind of suggested, I'm an ecologist. I spend a lot of time walking in flowers looking for bees, and I realized pretty quickly that the people kind of matter here. It's not just the bees. Me doing the work in the fields of flowers doesn't actually change what happens.
It sounds like a nice gig.
Yeah, it was nice, and but yeah, so kind of unwillingly, I've been forced into this sort of space of the human dimensions of conservation, and you really, really see how that comes to play with bee conservation, because there are so many stakeholders. There's farmers, there's NGOs, there's the public. How the public understands bee diversity and how the different industries kind of benefit from, managed bees or what have you, really has dictated or kind of moved along where the policy has gone. So scientists need to work with NGOs to help educate the public about what the main threats are to bees and what needs to happen, because that's really how policy is developed. And then I help run Bumblebee Watch, which is a citizen science program in partnership with NGOs like the Xerces Society and Wildlife Preservation Canada. And that citizen science project, I mean, there are many citizen science projects out there, but that one in particular is one of the best ways that people can help save the bees, because all you need is a phone. It's a free phone app or a camera to upload to the website. And you're giving us information about where rare species are, what the different bees are feeding off of, how their ranges are changing with climate change. So helping the citizen scientists helping us gather data has really changed how we're able to do our research. And some of that has even been submitted as expert testimony to Senate committees and things like that. We found that working with the public, NGOs, working with government, parks, land managers, and farmers is really critical to getting some of this work done.
Can you tell us the name of the citizen science program again, in case people want to look for it and sign up?
Yeah, so that's bumblebeewatch.org, or you can look up the free phone app, which is Bumblebee Watch.
Thanks. Amro, I know you also work with a lot of partners. Can you tell us a bit about what an ideal partnership looks like?
Yeah, so I think I think in this day and age, we really need to kind of expand and do bigger research and more impactful research. And I think you can't really get that done just sitting on your own in a facility. So I'm very fortunate to have kind of partners that are academic, other researchers that have expertise that are different than mine, that allow me to kind of do things that I normally don't do. And I think our internal incipient organized research unit, BEEc, I think is an attempt at this to kind of get people, academics from different expertise, not just bee biology, but in math and economics and engineering, to try to kind of do research that is going to be transformational to us solving the bee health issues. But also, you wanna engage with the end users, the people that you need their buy-in to essentially allow you to do the research that you need and to lead to the change that we want to see in the world. So, in my research, we collaborate a lot with beekeepers. Actually, we ran like the Great Canadian Honeybee Genetic Survey, where we got about 800 beekeepers from all over Canada, including one beekeeper from the Yukon, to send us bees, and we looked at their genetics. We work a lot with the Ontario Beekeepers Association and their tech transfer team. And I try as much as possible to actually kind of engage in some of the committees that think about policy and try to implement policy about honeybee health, but also pollinator health in Canada. And I think all of these are kind of key, because as scientists, you can only do so much. And if you want to translate your research to benefit society, I think there has to be that end piece in terms of talking with end users and people in policy, so that way whatever solutions that you could think of that could help pollinators are ultimately going to be put in use and accepted.
Well, if people are sending you bees from the Yukon, it sounds like they're pretty engaged. They're pretty into it. You've got good partners.
Yeah, we're extremely fortunate in that end.
Yeah. Laurence, a little bit more for my bee education here. I know that there are some things out there some things that I probably think about bees that aren't supported by science. You know, I think bees are hardworking, but I don't know, maybe there are lazy bees. I have no idea, but I know that there are a lot of misconceptions. Can you share with us some of the major misconceptions about bees, and maybe a little bit about how we could communicate about bees more effectively, or get rid of those misconceptions?
Okay, thanks. That's a good question. So the idea that bees work hard, about 20% of all bee species actually don't do any work at all.
Lazy bees.
Sorry?
Lazy bees.
Well, sometimes being a parasite can be hard work. So they don't collect any food or construct a nest for their offspring. Instead, they go into the nests of other bees and lay eggs on the food that the host bee has collected. So there's lots of cuckoo bees that do that. There's actually an example of one of those on this picture, the one in the middle at the top. That's a mating pair of Sphacodes bees. These are black and red. They look quite wasp-like, and they attack the nests of bees like the ones on the bottom row. The three species on the bottom row of this image are in the same family as that cuckoo bee in the middle at the top, but it lays its eggs in the nests of these relatives of itself. So lots of bees don't work very hard. Honey is made by bees, but out of the 20,500 odd species of bees, maybe 500 or 600 make honey. The rest don't make any honey at all. Honey is a storage. It's a food for a rainy day. And most bees, being solitary, they don't need to store food except as food for their offspring. And so that's the pollen and the nectar. Most bees nest in the ground. Most people don't think that that's the way things are. And lots of bees look an awful lot like wasps. If you look at the bee in the middle on the left, that's a little bit waspy, but there are plenty of bees that look far more wasp-like than that. And in fact, if you give even entomologists a quiz and show them pictures of bees that look like wasps and wasps that look like bees, even professional entomologists will often get that wrong.
So the key is they're vegetarian and hard to identify. With these misconceptions that people have, how do we combat this? And how can we communicate about bees more effectively? I mean, obviously panels like this, this is a great way to talk to people about bees, but what are some thoughts that you have?
Well, all of us on this team do a considerable amount of outreach. I give a dozen talks to the general public each year on average, reaching hundreds to thousands of people. Sheila also does, Amro and Sandra. We all give talks to large numbers of the general public. We've written a booklet on the bees of Toronto that's put out by the Biodiversity Center in City Hall, and that's turned out to be the most popular booklet they've ever produced, and it's in its second printing, and there are thousands of copies. One should be available in everybody's local library in the greater Toronto area. So we write books or booklets, and I've got an Instagram page where at the Packer Lab, and we put up a picture of a bee every day, Monday to Friday each week, and then on weekends we put a wasp up there because weekends and wasp begin with the same letter, and wasps are as interesting to me as bees are, and they're much maligned, unnecessarily so. So yeah, we're all active in outreach, trying to bring the diversity of bees to the attention to the general public.
Well, you're doing a great job. That for people who are watching, that pamphlet that Laurence referred to is in the chat. So there's a link to the PDF if you don't make it to the library or need another route since they're closed right now. You can actually download it. Sandra, thinking about the kind of work that this group does, trying to get messages out about bees and misconceptions and education around bees, is there anything when you're out there in the world that you experience people tend to have certain misconceptions or questions that come up a lot?
Yeah, whenever talking to most people, even scientists, they ask me, oh, where do you keep your honeybees and how are your hives doing? And so, yeah, there's a big, tremendous misconception that all bees make honey or that the honeybee is the bee. And so this idea that there are 20,000 species and that most bees are solitary and that I study bees that live in sticks, they think that's fantastic, right? I study these tiny little bees that live inside of a rose or raspberry stem. So, you'd see it, you'd think it's an ant, but no, it's a bee. And so there's a lot to learn. And a lot of the basic biology people don't know. A lot of the media portrays bees incorrectly. If anyone's seen the Bee movie, Jerry Seinfeld shouldn't have been a worker. Males are not workers, females are workers. So there's just a lot of basic misconceptions. There's a lot of focus on honeybee. There's a dearth of information on wild bees. And so, yeah, we do a lot of public education. Laurence spoke to a lot of the books and outreach they do. I've also written a book on the bees of New England and then another one on Eastern North America, and I can share that link for posting. It's freely available, and so we get funding to provide this public education. That's a lot of the work we do, is this outreach. And yeah, so we do what we can. Another fun project I've started is the idea of a bee BioBlitz. This is an idea where you can actually get community members together, school groups, conservationists, naturalists, and go out and en masse observe and document the wild biodiversity all around us. And so we've done this in New England quite often, and we're documenting rare species, declining species, habitats, pollinator and plant associations. So people in the community can provide invaluable information, and so we partner with them as well. And the manpower of the general interest in bees is wonderful, and so we can use their interests to actually fuel our science.
That's really fun that you do BioBlitzes and get all those people out at once. I'm sure, are people worried about, okay, misconception, are they worried about getting stung? Are they worried about how do we do this with our class?
Usually, people who come have no fear of being stung. They're pretty bold. But yeah, interestingly, only females possess a sting. And most wild bees are so small, they couldn't sting you if they wanted to. So I've been working with bees for 15 years and probably only been stung twice that I know of. So they're pretty tiny, their sting's pretty small, and yeah, they're very non-aggressive compared to the more social bees. And so the solitary bees are very happy just to be left alone.
Sandra, I'm going to stick with you for a minute here. So thanks very much for expanding on some of the other misconceptions and adding to what Laurence shared. I was wondering, what are some of the challenges that you're facing in the field at the moment? And is there anything that we can do to help?
Yeah, I think a lot of the challenges I face are the misconceptions. Kind of trying to elevate the importance of wild bees and that research. So unfortunately, because a lot of public perception kind of spills over into how science is done, that more advocacy for wild bees and wildlife conservation is necessary to really protect this wildlife. And as Sheila noted, many of these species are in fact in decline. And so we're trying to move the needle, and I've been very happy to see in the last 5 years that the greater public education of wild bees and their importance, and the fact that those ones are the ones actually endangered and in threat. So yeah, it's this kind of constant advocacy that needs to happen to educate not only the general public, but also the government, policymakers and things. So it takes a large effort, and platforms like this really do help.
Yeah, you're so right. There's been a bit of a sea change where people are starting to open their eyes and see how important bees are and understand them and jump in. I mean, it's amazing that this whole team can do so many public outreach events and so many people attend. That is really good news. Amro, with this idea of the challenges and misconceptions, what do you think some of the biggest challenges are in the field at the moment? I see even in the chat, someone said, how do we tell people not to panic when they see a bee and flail wildly? And I know that there's a lot of fear out there about bees, and very topical right now, including the idea of the murder wasp. And I wonder if you can share a bit about that.
So I'll just touch on what Sandra mentioned, and there's certainly a lot of challenges, and the problems are real, and the threats are real, and we have to do something. But one comforting thing for me is when I started my career as a grad student, like in the 90s, it's just been kind of, you couldn't convince anybody you couldn't convince the media to write a story about bees. And now it's just like my phone is ringing off the hook. So I've seen in just my personal time as a grad student and early on as a professor, this massive kind of change in public perception. And so that's what kind of comforts me, is that there is this interest. People care about bees. People make the association: bees, food, beautiful flowers, I can't I'm always astounded to see all of these media coverages about like bees and stories that just did not happen in the past. So I think it's just a matter of increasing this momentum and harnessing its energy and kind of have people make the connection that they already kind of appreciate bees, and now we just need to make the next steps to kind of have changes in behavior, changes in policy that will support bee populations. So in terms of just what are the kind of challenges, I think I'll speak a little bit about honeybee health specifically, but more broadly about pollinator health, native bee health in general. So we have a sense of what the issues are, just in a general kind of a big picture idea. Yes, parasites, pests, poor nutrition. And what I think the next challenge is to go from this kind of general knowledge of what the stressors are to very kind of specific knowledge. So, why is this bumblebee in this habitat declining? What are the stressors that are acting there? Why is this managed honeybee colony experiencing a decline in numbers? What are the stressors that are happening there? So stressor-specific information, because having like a general picture of what are the stressors are is useful, but for us to kind of have an action, we need to know specifically, right? So it's just like a human health, right? It's not useful for you to go to the doctor. It's like, yeah, I could see that you're sick, and yeah, you could have this type of cancer or that type of cancer and so on. That's not useful, right? You need a specific diagnosis. And so actually what I'm trying to do for honeybees with a large colleague of Canadian researchers, this is part of a Genome Canada project called BCSI, is to actually develop stressor-specific biomarkers where we could take a colony and assay some of the workers and get some specific knowledge about the stressors that are affecting the health of that colony, so we could have appropriate action. And we're hoping that the honeybee is going to be the stepping stone for pollinators. So once we have this technology developed for the honeybee, we hope that we could develop it for native bees. So again, we could use the same types of tools to assess the health of declining bumblebee populations and so on. So actually, I collaborated with Sheila on developing a genome for the yellow banded bumblebee. And we're hoping that this gets us a platform. Now that we know what the sequence is, we could go on and try to use genomics to try to understand why this bee is declining. In terms of the murder wasp, so this is an invasive species coming from Asia. It's been in the news a lot, but just everybody stay calm. It's just we have very, very few number of colonies. We're still not sure whether they've established it. It could be contained, and it's nothing essentially to kind of panic about.
Thank you. That's reassuring. I think we all needed to hear that. Okay, I have a big picture question I want to ask, and that might be, it could be maybe a little bit sad because we're dealing with a lot of stuff on our plates right now out there in the world. But then I have a fun, inspirational question for everybody. So I'll start with the tougher question. So what are some of the most critical changes that we must make for a sustainable future when we're considering the Sustainable Development Goals and the need for action on climate change, and as it relates to bees? Sheila, I'm going to go to you first and ask you specifically about climate change and what we need to do.
Yeah, that's a pretty big question. I'm not sure if we have time to fully answer it, but certainly our native pollinators and many of our wildlife species are being impacted by climate change. The increase of spring storms can really knock out some of the spring forage that they have access to, which they really need after a winter of sleeping. They need to build up their food. And we've seen an increase of spring storms in Southern Ontario in particular. Things like droughts and floods, obviously a problem. Not having enough snow cover in the winter time might mean our sleeping pollinators are more exposed to cold temperatures. There's some bees that are specialized on certain flowers. So there's a mining bee that is specialized to spring beauty, a spring ephemeral, and trying to understand how the changes in bloom periods of a plant and when the bee comes out, how that might change with climate change. These are all like really important things that we're thinking about. And I work on bumblebees. They're like the polar bears of the insect world. They're fuzzy. They're actually more diverse as you go north and on higher up on mountains. So they're like the cold weather insect. So it seems like they in particular might be impacted by climate change. So going forward, I mean, you can definitely garden in a way that might help pollinators deal with climate change. So using drought tolerant and frost tolerant native plants, making sure you have something in bloom all the way from the spring to the late fall. Like no one likes goldenrod, but goldenrod's a great plant to have. It's an important forage for our fall insects to build up those fat stores before they go to sleep, or for in the case of monarchs to have enough energy to migrate over the Great Lakes. So there are definitely ways to garden, but really tackling climate change at sort of the national, political, global level are all really important things. It's kind of interesting to see that disconnect. Like everyone wants to save the bees, but tackling climate change just seems like this larger problem, but they're definitely connected, and we need to think about it in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say I just learned about goldenrod and how important it is last year, and I planted some. I was like, oh, really? Goldenrod in my yard? Okay, for the bees. Thanks for that. Sandra, I know that you have some perspectives about land use in particular and how we can take action on climate.
Yeah, so over the years, we've been documenting what called plant pollinator networks. And so this idea where we can assess wild bees in the community as well as what flowers they visit. And this kind of information is vital to understanding what the bees actually need. And so there's always requests for what should I plant, what do the bees need, what do they eat. And so in doing so, we document this need for flower resources all season long. Just like we like to eat every day all year round, the bees need that food availability also. So a lot of people have spring and summer flowers, but as Sheila mentioned, this idea of needing the late fall flowers, these goldenrods, are pretty important as well. The early spring, there's a bit of a food desert there, so not spraying pesticides and allowing dandelions and other weedy things to grow gives more available food sources for bees. And then in terms of nutrition, we're doing a lot of work to firstly characterize the nutrition of flowers. That's surprisingly understudied. And it turns out they need the same essential amino acids we do, so they get that from their diet. And so what floral sources provide optimal diets, and how do we make those flowers available? And so we're using a lot of genomic tools as well to document what food bees eat, what they need, and doing these kind of experiments to try to optimize bee health and surviving one year to the next. And so this kind of foundational research is really allowing us to inform what people plant in parks and gardens, and moving forward how to make sustainable urban centers, backyards, and these things. So we're doing what we can, because currently there's really just an absence of information. Everyone wants to save the bees, and there's a lot of action out there, but we're acting to inform that with science and best practices that don't really exist in a full form just yet.
Mm-hmm. So I have you to thank for my goldenrod. Thank you. I think that research is really exciting. I mean, as an end user, as somebody with a little tiny yard, and that's something that I can understand and digest and take action on. I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Sandra. What do you find exciting? What is the most exciting next direction in bee research?
Well, there's so many. I'm like a kid in a candy shop and studying bees that nobody really pays attention to. So I don't study the honeybee or the bumblebee, which are kind of the two pillars of bee biology and research right now. I study all the weird and wonderful other kinds, more like Laurence. And so we find new species, we find new varieties of social behavior. They're far more complex. There's a long history. We thought the males did nothing in these societies, and now we're learning some of the males hang out in the nests, and what is that about? And we're sequencing all kinds of the wild bee genomes. So we've got about 16 in the works right now. And so it's a really exciting time to be studying these non-model systems, and kind of the technologies there. We can do a lot in a single lab that we before couldn't even conceive. And so I'm relatively new to York, so I'm very excited. I have a very large team of students and these collaborations to really launch us forward. So I'm really just excited at the opportunity and look forward to being able to get it back into my lab. Yeah.
I can tell you're excited. Laurence, Sandra just said that you both study the weird and wonderful bees. So Laurence, what are some of the exciting next things happening in bee research for you?
Well, we're 20,000 plus species plus thousands yet to be described.
Yeah, you're still cataloging, yeah.
Yep, that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, and people in my lab also describing new species of bees. And that's kind of fun. It might not be exciting for most people, but it is the basics for all biology. If you can't name something, then you don't know what it is. You can't find much about its biology. Whereas if you can identify it, then you've got that gives you a foothold into a whole wide range of literature. So in addition to merely describing all of these bees, I'm aiming to try and make them more readily identifiable by developing user-friendly identification guides. So for example, there's a key to the genera of bees in eastern Canada that's on the Canadian Journal of Arthropod Identification website. I'll put a link to it up on the chat in a minute, because nobody can remember that, or let alone type in all those words without making a spelling mistake. But all you need is that key, which is an online interactive key, and a microscope, and you'll be able to identify any bee that you find in your garden, as long as it keeps still long enough. So, you know, many people wouldn't find that exciting, but I do. And then, you know, with all this diversity, putting all bees into an evolutionary tree. Lots of people are involved with doing this using fancy technology, and I'm helping colleagues here and there all over the world doing that, because there are quite a few bees that I've got that nobody else has ever seen. And then once we've got that evolutionary tree, we can start understanding other things, such as how many times have bees evolved to be cuckoo bees rather than hardworking. How many times have bees moved from the New World to the Old World, or in the other direction? And can we tie the answers to those questions in terms of the geological history of the planet? That's actually, you know, in many ways the most exciting, because it's the most difficult. You need to be able to understand not just the bee morphology to put the fossils into a phylogeny, you need to do the bee molecular biology. You come up with a big phylogeny, and then you've got to learn about the geological history of the planet, which is a bit mind expanding and very difficult, but a heck of a lot of fun.
It sounds like the way that you put it, it does sound like fun. Sheila and Amro, before I go to you, I have one question from the chat. I just want to go back to Sandra for a second. There's a question specifically for you, Sandra. If someone wanted to find a Seratina nest in a rose or raspberry stem, how would you recommend searching for them? And how would you know if you found a nest? I don't even know what a Seratina nest is. Oh, you're still on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Life in the time of Zoom. So that's the bee I studied the most. I've actually started studying that bee in my mom's backyard. She had raspberry plants, and so when you prune rose or raspberry of the dead stems, it exposes the pithy core, and this is a very valuable nesting resource for a lot of wild bees. Many live in stems, and the Seratina, or a common name, is the small carpenter bee. They're the cousins to the large carpenter bee that more people know about. Anyway, they live in these stems, and they just kick out the pith, and this time of year is when they're actually founding their nests. So if you have raspberry or rose in your garden or parks or backyard, you're going to probably prune them about a month ago, and so that avails a lot of nesting resources. And so if you see a little round entrance hole, and often you'll see them during the day, they plug it up with their abdomen. So you'll see this kind of metallic blue-green little sheen, or sometimes their little face will stick out as well.
Stop.
And yeah, they're very cute. So if you go to my website, I have tons of pictures of them and what's going on inside of their nest. And it's a very tractable system because it's a complete linear nest. And so we know exactly what the mums are doing in there. Anyway, I could talk for an hour on that, but yeah, that's how you find those nests.
That's pretty fun. That's pretty fun. Sheila, what are you excited about out there in bee research?
So for a conservation biologist studying rare species, it's really hard to get excited about things these days, but I'm definitely trying. And one of the ways that I'm doing that now is through the Finding Flowers project with my co-PI, Lisa Myers, who's also a professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies. So it's inspired by a Mi'kmaq artist, Mike McDonald, who planted pollinator gardens as an act of resistance and works of art across Canada in the 90s. So we're learning about what he knew and the stories that he told and was told as he was doing all of this. And it's kind of funny because I mentioned how we need to plant, something that blooms in the spring and then things that bloom all the way out into the fall. And for his gardens, he knew that in the 90s. Like, this is like not new information. He planted his gardens in a way that there was always something blooming here. Like he'd have wild strawberry, and then all the way to the goldenrod and asters too. So we are learning about tobacco pollination and different medicinal plants for just different indigenous groups. And that's really been exciting because it's combining these different knowledge systems and learning from artists and working with artists and, you know, using the science as art installations and kind of working across those different disciplines has been really fun for me.
That sounds fantastic. And Amro, what are you excited about?
Yeah, I'm just excited for kind of I feel like we're at the cusp of the next phase of pollinator conservation. We spent the last 2 decades kind of thinking about where and who, which are the bees that are declining and where. And I think we're close to getting at the like why and how questions. And once we get there, then I think to me, I could envision a road where we're doing things that are actually bringing the bees back. So we're getting to a place where we could actually like put research over the past several decades into action and try to recover at-risk species and for the managed pollinators improve their health outcomes.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit to more action that some of us can take. As you can imagine, because you do these kinds of talks all the time, all of you, and I'm sure you know people are hungry for that information. What can I do? And in the emails that people sent in advance with questions, as well as some of the questions that are happening in the chat now, it's very much along that vein. So if people aren't farmers, if they're, you know, if we're just, you know, living in a house or have an apartment with a balcony, or what can we do? Is it about planting the goldenrod for the fall? Is it about making good consumer choices? Is it about leaving the raspberry bushes alone? I mean, what actions, what kind of other actions can we take as individuals? Maybe Sheila, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so there are a few ways. We already mentioned gardening, particularly native plants, and thinking about drought tolerant and frost tolerant. And Bumblebee Watch, sending scientists pictures so we can track species and try to find the rare and endangered species. Those are probably the 2 biggest things. We've talked a lot about sort of the different problems with and misconceptions that people have about bees. So really one of the first things is just to go outside and watch some flowers and try to notice all the different types of things that are visiting different flowers, and then starting to talk to people, because a lot of people think yellow jackets are bees and they have this fear, or maybe they only know of the honeybee as bees, and really trying to like sort of build a network of communication by spreading the knowledge that you learn here and just by your own observations. And these are things that anyone can do, whether or not they have their own personal garden.
Mm-hmm. And before I leave you, because we have been talking about, you were mentioning the rare bees. Are there bees that are thriving?
Yeah, there are definitely a few species that seem to do really well, especially in cities, and they seem to be adapted to use things like we have the common eastern bumblebee here, which seems to be expanding naturally both northward and eastward into the Maritimes, and we find nests in people's decks, in people's sheds. They seem to be really adaptable. They have sort of a medium tongue length, so they can go to all sorts of different flowers. So there are some species that are doing well, and that's one of the things as a conservation biologist I also struggle with, because whenever I say I study bees that are in decline, people will be like, no, well, come to my garden, you'll see lots of bumblebees, they're not in decline there. But I'm more interested in resilience of ecosystems and species diversity, so trying to keep as many species as possible, not just a lot of 1 or 2 species. That's a really important distinction.
Okay. There is a great thing happening in this chat box. Just I know you're busy listening to the questions. I don't know if you're able to check it out, but there's a great conversation happening in there. And I've been asked also, someone asked if we can save the chat with the video recording so that people can go back. Unfortunately, I don't think we do have that capability, but if you go to bee.yorku.ca, we're going to post bees, plural, my mistake, bees.yorku.ca. We're going to post as much as we can in terms of the relevant information that people have been sharing. I don't know, Amro, if people are going to share your garden on that website, but it's here in the chat, a link to your garden. So you're taking action at home.
Yeah, the first thing that we did when we bought a property in Vaughan is we got rid of this beautiful manicured grass. Well, I didn't think it was beautiful, but my neighbors thought I was a little bit crazy. I think some of them still do think that I'm a little bit crazy, but so we ripped all the grass and we planted a pollinator garden that started out with about 30 species of native flowers. I've since added a few more kind of non-native flowers, but they're still good for bees. And you know, so that's one way you could help. And you know, I think that I think you could appreciate more. You could appreciate bees a little bit more if you're able to go out in your garden and see them in action, and you know, the fear kind of goes away when you're surrounded by buzzing bees and nothing happens. But also if you have like a vegetable garden, and I have a pollinator garden in the front, and I have a second pollinator garden and a vegetable garden in my backyard. And you know, when you see, you know, early on we have blackcurrants bloom really early, and I was super excited to see the bumblebees come out to pollinate the blackcurrants. So bumblebees, as far as I could tell, are do really well with pollinating blackcurrants. Honeybees, I don't think do really well. So it's like super excited because, you know, it's getting the association of a bee on a flower to me now means that I'm gonna have like awesome blackcurrant jam in July, or blackberry jam. So it's doing these little things. You know, I would advise against like trying to get into beekeeping as a hobby, and like keeping a honeybee colony is not really gonna do anything about bumblebees. And you know, having a honeybee colony is a huge responsibility. Often there's bylaws that kind of prevent you from having a colony in a small space, like a typical home in the GTA area. But you know, having a pollinator garden, appreciating the bees, kind of educating yourself, and I think and kind of stepping back and realizing that bees are important. They're super cute and furry, and we need them for our ecosystems. And then trying to, you know, after making that realization, try to kind of think about, okay, what can I do more other than planting a pollinator garden? So you know, supporting the development of policies that will lead to kind of more sustainable agricultural ecosystems, more sustainable urban environment. And I think if we're getting to that place where you're thinking about, you know, what can I do to make my ecosystem, the surrounding ecosystem in my garden in Toronto, but also like Ontario in general, be a better place for bees, then I think the battle is kind of almost won at that point. If we have enough people making these, having these thoughts, then I think we're in a really good place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Policy change is needed if we're going to make this a reality. On the flip side of, you know, protecting the bees that we have and giving them the habitat they need, Laurence, is there something? What do we need to know about invasive bees? And yeah, are they a real issue in Ontario? Are there things that we can do to take action in our yards or on the policy front to help with prevention?
Okay, thanks. That's actually a complicated question. First of all, we need to be able to identify them. There is one introduced bee that has been having a negative impact on the large carpenter bees, which is that's a native, and it's a giant resin bee that takes over the nests of the large carpenter bee by getting resin and gumming up the bee that it's attacking, so that it can take over its nest and the bee can't defend itself. That one's fairly easy to identify, but the problem is that there are lots of other bees that are very difficult to separate from the native ones. And here I have to point out that a lot of these bee hotels that have become very popular in the last few years, a student of mine, Scott McIver, studied these in the Greater Toronto area intensively, and he found that about half of the nests that were taken, that were occupied, were actually occupied by wasps. But these were good wasps because they're doing biological control of the caterpillars and the aphids and other pests that are eating the plants you're growing in your garden. And the other half that were occupied by bees, but both for the bees and the wasps, half of the nests were occupied by non-native species, and it is actually often very difficult to tell them apart. So if you're going to be using these bee hotels to try and attract bees, and you're trying to attract native bees, you're actually going to be doing a favor for some of the introduced and potentially invasive species also. But I'll take this opportunity. Yeah, it is
I have
a
a
problem.
bee hotel. Oh.
But I'll take this opportunity to agree with Amro. Yes, get rid of the lawn. One of the things I tell people is to ignore "don't walk on the grass" signs. Lots of bees, like most bees, nest in the ground, and most ground nesting bees prefer little bald, bare patches of soil to start their nests in. So a lawn is hopeless. Raspberries are really good because it's not just Serotina that nest in them. There's 2 other genera of bees. I've got 3 genera of bees nesting in the raspberry canes in my backyard. And to go back to goldenrod, goldenrod's great. It's not just the bumblebees that use it. There's actually some solitary bees that will collect pollen only from goldenrod, and there are several species of those around here that you'll see late in the summer. So yeah, grow weeds.
That's good advice for all of us. Thanks, Laurence. So we've been monitoring the chat, and I know many of you have touched on, Laurence, you're even jumping in and answering questions right in the chat. That's fantastic. But we also got quite a few email questions before the panel. So Sonia, I think if you don't mind chiming in, I know you've got a few questions that people have emailed in.
Sorry, I couldn't take myself off mute. Thank you again, everybody. We have several questions that came in. We'll try to get through as many as we can within the next 20 minutes or so. So the first question that was submitted in advance is, what does a city which supports native pollinators and managed hives look like? Is this even possible?
I like that question. I don't know who wants to take it.
I guess I can start. Maybe Amro might want to follow up. Yeah, that's something that we grapple with a lot because honeybees have been here for a long time, and people do want local honey, but there are issues with disease transfer from honeybees to wild bees and competition issues because honeybee hives are huge. They're tens of thousands of individuals, and they store food for the winter, which none of our bees do. So there was a recent study by Jim Kane that showed that a single apiary, which was I think about 40 hives, took as much pollen as 3 million solitary bees would need, and that's not even looking at nectar resources. So the honeybee hives do tend to take a lot of resources out of, in cities in particular, where they might be limited in terms of how many flowers we have available. But I think some of the things that I'm working on sort of on the policy level is thinking about what it would look like to really be able to screen honeybee hives to make sure that the hives that are out there interacting with our native bees are free of as many diseases as possible. And I know this is something that Amro is also working on. And then also learning about how, in terms of what resources honeybee hives need versus wild bees, and trying to understand that competition bit a little bit more, trying to understand exactly how much habitat we need to add if we do want to have honeybee hives in an area. I also feel pretty strongly about honeybee hives not being introduced into protected areas or areas where there are species, populations of bees that are at risk of extinction, just because we don't really understand that interaction very well. So the precautionary principle in those cases is probably the best way. And we do have some rare species in cities. So in Toronto, we do have the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is a species at risk. So these are definitely things that we're working on, and Amro and I sometimes have lively conversations about it, but we're just going to keep trying to move forward as best as we can.
Amro, do you want to weigh in with your lively conversations?
Yeah. I mean, it's all fine. There's a lot of there's a lot of uncertainty about the effects of competition. But I think what Sheila and I could both agree on is like a city that is better for bees is going to be a greener city than we currently have. So by essentially maybe converting some of the habitat that is there, that is not really not habitat, but structures that are there that are not really doing anything for bees into more friendly alternatives. So we talked about I walk down my street and it's all grass effectively, and I just see the potential. Like, man, it would be so amazing if all of these front lawns were just pollinator gardens. You could imagine we could substantially increase the amount of habitat available and floral resources available for bees just by having this small transformation. I mean, it doesn't have to be a transformation. Like succession will happen. We maybe not intentionally trying to plant a garden, but just like stop removing all the weeds or looking at dandelions not as a pesky, annoying weed that has to be nuked with all of these very dangerous agrochemicals into this is a harbinger of spring. It's a first nectar source for bees. So it's it's often one of the first things that kind of blooms and provides nectar for native and managed bees. So, a welcome guest instead of an annoying weed into a welcome guest. We actually, this is a great question because, it's something that we think we have thoughts about how to make the city better for bees, but we don't have a lot of data. So actually, Sheila Colla and myself are doing this really cool study, and it's specific to Toronto. So this is a study where we took Toronto, divided into 2 by 2 kilometer grids, and we sampled bumblebees, and we're doing some genetic testing on it, and we're using the genetics to estimate how far bees have to forage, how far bees have to travel to forage, and how many nests are in a specific area. And we're overlaying this data with lots of very rich data sets from Toronto about whether, how much concrete is there, how much green space. And from this exercise, we're gonna get some objective data about, okay, what kind of habitats, what kind of neighborhoods in Toronto support the best bumblebee habitat, and how we could recreate that intentionally. The study hasn't been published yet, but just kind of spoiler alert, concrete is bad. And I'll stop
usually it is. But you're right, it doesn't have to be this full-scale transformation. I mean, we can start with one plant, and I know that even if you live in an apartment, if you have a balcony, pollinators, they can go up, they can make it several flights and get to the food source.
Yeah.
Laurence, you had an intervention there by text, old-fashioned text, holding it up to the camera. No mulch. You want to get in on that?
Yeah, so most bees nest in the ground. Most gardeners surround the plants they're interested in with mulch. You wouldn't like it if somebody tipped tons of compost on top of your house. Neither do the bees that nest in the ground. So minimize the use of mulch, please.
That's a good tip. Thank you. I will take that to heart. Sonia, I think we probably have time for one more question from the advanced questions through email. Do you have another one for us?
Yes, definitely. So let me see which one to pick here. So one question that we received in advance actually came in from the chat box that I think would be really interesting, is why are almond farms destroying bee population?
Ooh. Who wants to, Amro, you unmuted.
I'll say that this is a kind of a US-centric question. And so in the US, a lot of some estimates is 70 to 80% of the honeybee colonies in the US travel to California for almond pollination, and almond is not a very kind of nutritious plant for bees. So effectively, the bees are spending a large several weeks in a nutritional desert. So like with any question like this, often it's easy to kind of think of. I don't want to speak a lot about this because it's a U.S. issue, but it's easy to try to kind of point the blame as like it's the almond farmers, but also the beekeepers are willingly moving their colonies to these areas because they make a profit. So I think it's a problem that if we step back a little bit and we could think about how could we get almonds while still maintaining bee health. And instead of trying to like pit one group against each other, just kind of step back and think about what needs to be in place to have all elements, but also have colonies that are not starving and getting sick as a result.
Yeah, that's a good approach, but also the idea of thinking about the nutrition. I mean, I honestly had never thought about nutrition value for bees. You know, isn't it all the same, one flower to the next?
No, actually. So, I mean, perhaps Sandra could chime in, but bees do have some specific nutritional preferences, and it's not like one flower is good for all bees.
Okay. That's good to know. I know Sonia has a more Canadian-focused question that she wants that somebody sent in.
Yes. So have any steps been taken by the federal or provincial governments to protect bees, and are they being implemented?
Super question. Who would like to? Okay, Amro, you got your hand up, and Sheila, you're unmuted. Why don't we go with Sheila and then Amro?
All right, sounds good. So this is also something that I'm working on with my lab, and there have been some policies focused on bees at the federal level and at the provincial level. Both the plans really focus on honeybees, so managing the honeybee industry in a way that might be more sustainable. In Ontario, we had the Pollinator Action Plan that really focused on neonicotinoid pesticides and trying to reduce them. It ended up being an aspirational reduction, and I'm not really sure if on the ground it actually led to decreases of neonics. But in terms of what is most harming are the bees that we know that are at risk of extinction, which are climate change and pathogen spillover from managed bees. There hasn't been a ton of policy around that. I will say I'm really proud of the City of Toronto's pollinator policy or pollinator strategy, I forget what it's called, but the one for the City of Toronto. I helped design that, and it really does focus on native bees and the actual threats to native bees, not just sort of picking and choosing some things. And I think it's one of the first in North America that really put native bee conservation at the forefront and thinking about not just conserving pollinators in general, but actually how we support species that are at risk of extinction. So that's a really good one to check out. But yeah, going forward, I'd really like to see more broad level, like a national pollinator strategy, which is one of the things my lab's working on trying to develop, what that would look like, and developing policies that don't just pit like ENGOs and farmers against each other, but actually really show who the stakeholders are and where the opportunities are to work together and to sort of bridge some of those divides, because we have a large country here and there are a lot of stressors, a lot of players, and we need to figure out what we can do to really get moving on some of these things.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Amro?
No, I think Sheila put it really eloquently. I don't think I could add anything to that. Thank you.
Sandra, did you have a perspective on this? And you're still muted.
All right, so yeah, I think the emphasis is we need data. It's hard to advocate for something when you don't have the science to back it. So a lot of the work I've done in the last 6 years has really been documenting wild bee declines, studying the weird and wonderful bees. And so we published last year one of the first status assessments for non-Apis or Bombus wild bees. And so in that, we're identifying other species that need conservation consideration. There are, the vast majority of bees are not being studied, and so this need to document them and advocate for them and understand them. And that's something we're really elevating in our work. We are being asked to, include statements, and our publications are used for policy change and things like this. And so, yeah, I mean, I see my role as a scientist to really provide the data so that they can make informed choices. You can't advocate based on opinion. And so a lot of, boots on the ground needed. And we also really rely on museum specimens. So I'm not sure that's something anyone's talked about yet today, but this idea that historical collections and a lot of what's housed in Laurence's lab, but other museums like the ROM, there is wonderful historic records. And so a lot of the work my lab is doing too is looking back in time. How were bees 100 years ago? And how are they today? And how can we learn from the past? And so we can do this by sheerly examining presence and absence, but also looking at the morphology of the bees. And we're finding bees are actually getting smaller in time. So this might be a really good indicator that they're having less nutrition. Body size is so directly correlated to nutrition that when we see smaller bees, this is kind of a warning sign. And also tracking their genetics, we're seeing also what are the effects in time and how are these bee populations becoming more fragmented or isolated. So we're really trying to use everything in our power to really provide the data to inform policy and city planning and these things from a very grassroots level.
That data is critical. I'm a former policymaker myself, and policymakers don't have the answers. They need people like you to provide the data so that the policies can be drafted. Laurence, you wanted to get in on this.
Yeah, there's a great line that we can refer to museums by, given that museums are at risk of defunding all over the place these days, and that is that museums that hold biological material, it's the endangered dead. Like, we've got lots of specimens, but actually keeping them requires resources, and these museums are under threat almost as much, if not more, than actually the bees themselves are.
Thanks for that, Laurence. Last question before we wrap. And when I think about, you can go out there in the world and there are butterfly gardens. Everybody's making butterfly gardens in their own yards, or the city's making butterfly gardens, or the school yards are. Is there such a thing as a bee garden? And if there is, where can we go see them? How do we do this? I don't know if anyone can jump in on that.
I can answer that.
Yeah,
I've been working
Sandra.
a lot. I have a colleague in University of Toronto, Scott McIver. He's been doing a lot of great work with the City of Toronto and the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. And they're finding, they've been launched a program. So the City of Toronto has a program called Pollinate TO, and they actually award small grants to private landowners to develop bee gardens in their own properties. So if you go on I'm not sure the link, but we can find it and post it, to apply, and you can actually become active in your own yard and actually funded to be part of this initiative across the city. And this is also a national campaign. So people are more familiar with Bee City USA, but there's also Bee City Canada. So we can provide those links as well. And there's a lot of public outreach and information on how you can be bee safe in your own land and practices, but also they have bee universities and bee cities. And so City of Toronto is a bee city. It's one of the inaugural cities in Canada. So there is a lot of momentum. Again, there's a lot of push to want to better cities and society. But again, I emphasize we need the data. What should we be planting and what? So there's a little disconnect there, and that's something we hope to remedy in the very near future.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Just add to that?
Oh yeah, Sheila, go.
I also just wanted to add that native butterfly gardens are also native bee gardens. They're also native bird gardens and native wasp gardens. So if you plant species that are native to your region, you will be supporting a whole bunch of species. I think some people call them butterfly gardens because they're a little worried about bees, but the reality is that most bees are generalists, or there are many species of bees that will visit lots of different types of plants. And that the flowers that are really great for butterflies are also going to be great for hummingbirds and our native bees as well.
And those caterpillars will be the perfect food for birds, and those eggs will be the perfect food for skunks, and so on and so on. It's an excellent reminder that it's all part of the ecosystem. Thank you. For those of you who joined in a little bit late, do know that this will be posted on the Faculty of Environmental Studies Facebook page immediately. So we actually did record this session. We'll be sharing the link, I think, to all of you, but it's going to be on the Facebook page right away. And also, if you missed some of these resources that were popped into the chat, you can go to plural, bees.yorku.ca, and the resources will be there, posted there. So I really want to say thank you, Laurence, Sheila, Amro, Sandra. I'm still not a bee expert, but I certainly know a lot more about bees after this. And I'm really, really glad to know that there are experts like you out there working so hard to create a world where bees can thrive and where people can thrive. So happy World Bee Day to you, to all of you. Thanks. And I'm going to hand it over to Ree Wang, who is the Dean at the Faculty of Science at York University. And Ree is going to say a few words to close this out.
Am I on?
You are.
Thanks, Megan, and our moderator for the event, and our proud York alumni. Your curiosity-driven and community-targeted approach certainly assured the success of this session. To all of our panelists, and for your thoughtful insight and your perspective on bee research. Thank you. And we are also very grateful to the participants for attending and offering your great questions during the Q&A portion of the event. I did a little bit of calculation at the peak time of this session, and we had 166 participants for this session. What a great turnout. Today is World Bee Day. To be or not to be? This is a question we ask ourselves and ask the world. This is about the bee, about ecology, biodiversity, agriculture, about the environment, conservation, about the relationship of humans and the world. So early on this year, I had the opportunity to visit Dr. Laurence Packer's bee lab. What a treasure. Everything and anything about the bee, you will find the answer there. For those who want to have the same experience, please follow Dr. Packer online, and he has regular update and exhibition on what's happening in his lab and in the bee world. By the way, how many of you know and the City of Toronto have an official bee, and also have the official name given by Dr. Packer? So please figure out. Last week, Faculty of Science at York University hold multiple meetings to brainstorm on our research priority and our branding strategies. And certainly one of the differentiating factors for our research strength is the bee study. Now today's session, certainly you also have a taste of this excellence from the panelists, Dr. Sheila Colla, Dr. Laurence Packer, Dr. Sandra Rehan, Dr. Amro Zayed. This great research team at York has produced great discoveries, and you should expect more to come soon. My final plea to all participants, please work with us, engage us, and support each other. Together, we can ensure a cohesive and collaborative approach to protecting the pollinators that make our way of life possible, colorful, and full of buzz on bees. I'm sure all participants for today's session have noticed the ties of Dr. Zayed and Dr. Packer wear, all about bees. I'm just wondering whether this will become a new fashion. For more information on our faculty researchers and the research they are conducting, and you are encouraged to visit bees.yorku.ca. Thank you, and we hope you will enjoy us at our future events. Have a great bee day.